Good evening, and welcome to another webinar from malesurvivor.org. Our guest today is Stephen Procopio, a licensed independent clinical social worker who specializes in male victims of complex trauma. Mr. Procopio is the founder of the first freestanding independent program addressing the commercial sexual exploitation of boys, adolescent males, and trans youth in the United States. Mr. Procopio is a trainer and consultant for the Office of Victims of Crime Human Trafficking Center and the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, operating under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. He has served on the Massachusetts Attorney General's Task Force on Human Trafficking and is a member of the United Nations Global Human Trafficking Task Force. Stephen's recent work with Unitas North America on the curriculum of commercial sexual exploitation will be administered in the New York City public school system. Joining Mr. Procopio is Christopher Bates, an independent consultant specializing in issues of homeless youth and a leader in Mr. Procopio's trauma workshop. So, Mr. Procopio, welcome to the webinar. I wanted to start with a quote from a study authored by John Jay College of Criminal Justice in 2008, titled The Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children in New York City. The quote goes, "Heterosexual boys that described their disgust and shame about having sex with men for money provided some of the most riveting, harrowing, and heartbreaking accounts to come out of the mouths of the youth. And yet, they remain almost entirely invisible in the shadow cast by the stereotypical commercial sexual exploitation victims, pimped girls." So, certainly the trauma experienced by children and youth in commercial sexual exploitation is not solely of heterosexual boys or even boys in general. Yet it seems remarkable that in this report, in which over 300 interviews were conducted over 2 years, the authors remarked that the large number of boys that were recruited was a surprise. The report went on to say that at the start of the project, boys had only occasionally been mentioned by policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, and that no one had focused on male trafficking victims, either as a significant segment of the market or said anything about the unique set of problems faced by them. So I think this is a good place to start the conversation because it illustrates a significant and largely overlooked subset of commercial sexual exploitation. In the nearly decade and a half since this study was published, have we made any progress mitigating this problem?
To answer more specifically to your question, Lee, when I first began to, as a social worker, I did a lot of work with runaway and homeless youth and also men, adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So I was already in the network of working with males with some form of sexual victimization. I had no real knowledge of trafficking per se, other than what the stereotypes are, is that women are kidnapped from other countries and brought into the United States and forced into prostitution. So it was a very narrow outlook on the issue of trafficking. And what we know now is that, domestic trafficking is very prevalent in our country. It happens in every city and town and in every state. And there are many people that are involved in it. When I first wanted to approach working with boys in trafficking, unfortunately, there was no literature available on the topic. All the literature and the narrative was specific to women and girls. And when I spoke of my desire to try and do something with this particular population, I basically was given a major pushback by the trafficking community, who did not see it as an issue, nor did they have it as a part of a narrative. So I tried to do a lot of lit research where I really didn't get anywhere, except for this Susan McIntyre, who's a researcher in Canada, who did a research project on boys and trafficking. So that's where I got my initial information. And I thought, well, if it's happening in Canada, it's certainly happening here. So, when I talked to some colleagues of mine here in Boston who were women working with women and girls, I was basically told, well, with the boy issue, it kind of sort of happens. We think it's very minimal, just gay boys, and they're doing it of their own free will. So with that narrative, I having known males comprehensively who had a childhood sexual abuse issue, and knowing that for women and girls who are a part of the trafficking community, 80% of them have a childhood sexual abuse issue. I just sort of put those stats together and felt like, well, if it's happening for girls to that extent, it has to be happening for boys. So through the grace of some people who were willing to support me, I got some seed money to open up a project in Boston, which was the first one in the United States, as you mentioned. And so this is my 16th year. So it's been a long haul and a lot of ups and downs with this particular population, given that the national narrative still is primarily women and girls, but so many more people, and a lot of credos go to adult male survivors now, who over the years have been able to, with work with me and hearing about my work, have really been able to disclose their victimization around trafficking. And so a lot of people are doing, like Christopher is doing a lot of great work around the country. So we have more research that's been done. When I first started, the people that said it was kind of sort of happened thought it was maybe between 7 and 10% of victims of trafficking were males. And what we know now, these many years later, is it's 36 to 38% that we know now. And we're still doing research. And the research that you talked about with John Jay was done by Meredith Dank, who does great research on trafficking. And I have a colleague, Ina Pacheco, who works for Interpol in Paris, who's done a lot of research on this topic too. So it's been very helpful. What I wanted to mention is that with the trafficking definition that I gave you, it covers 4 key areas of victimization. Those victimized by human trafficking, which requires a third party, i.e. a trafficker. The commercial sexual exploitation, which does not require a third party. Boys who are working in the survival sex community, and then sex workers. So all those categories are protected by the federal law. And for those states, which I think we're at number 38 states now that have a safe harbor law that replicates the federal law. And trafficking, we used to think of people being brought across state lines, and that's no longer the case. You live at 6 Maple Avenue and you're being exploited at 8 Maple Avenue, that's trafficking. So, it can be very localized, or it can be, boys can be brought from state to state. So it's pretty much a global definition. So even though we've come a long way in the past, in my 16 years of doing this work, and I think Chris would agree, there's still a lot more to go with this to achieve parity and equality with women and girls.
Yeah, I think a great project that I was able to work on recently as a consultant and a commissioner for the Massachusetts Commission on Unaccompanied Homeless Youth was a project that I did, and it was the finding and recommendations of young adults experiencing homelessness that have exchange sex to meet their needs. And that phrase is neutral so that we can let the young people decide what it is that their experience is for them. But within that project, we found, I think there was a stat that it was like 40% of youth homelessness providers across the state of Massachusetts were providing safer sex supplies when we kind of did an audit and just kind of looking at how behind youth homelessness providers, and we're only thinking of like one condom measure there, right? We're not thinking about dental dams and other inclusive safer sex supplies. So even just starting at that point at the project and just trying to figure out what the landscape is around basic kind of essentials to help this population, it shows that there's a lot of room that needs to improve to make sure that we are being inclusive about male victimization, as well as increasing awareness around just like sex positivity, sex education, in a more inclusive way. And so that's where I just kind of wanted to kind of go off of what Stephen said, how there is room improvement because it's been shown in that project. So,
well,
I would also like to say thank you for having me here as well. And it's I think when I first came out as a survivor, it was like when I was asked to do this group, I remember looking to this group for support, and it's really an honor, and I feel blessed to be able to be a panelist here.
So, just to dovetail I'm going to dovetail Chris now for dovetailing me. And just to say, with all his work with the homeless population, what we do know is that so many young men or young boys who are homeless or runaways are at very high increase of being sexually victimized. And what we do know in this country, more than 50% of the homeless folks are young men and boys. So given that, that less than 10% data, does not hold true for me, and the 36 to 38% when that research was done by Meredith was done well. But I venture to say, and I know more research is getting done, that it's probably a larger number percentage-wise are victimized. What the problem is, though, is that the stigma that, what I learned by my work with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is that the trafficking component is much like rape in that it's not about the sex, it's about the abuse of power and control. And when in dealing with boys, you have a stigma of being sexually victimized, but you also have a lot of homophobia that goes with that, because people assume that if you are a survivor of trafficking and you're male and your offender was male, you must be gay. So with that, I think a lot of the non-gay community really pretty much stays underground and, are not really forthcoming in wanting to disclose, so we could reach out more to people who are being victimized to get them the appropriate services. So, between the homeless factor and then for trans youth who are marginalized, and for gay youth that are marginalized, many of which get kicked out of their home, they're more or less forced into the life of sexual victimization.
Sorry, I have a question about besides the shame and the experience of being a victim, is there another aspect of being trafficked, of being sort of controlled and manipulated by the trafficker, that adds another dimension to the level of abuse? So it's not only the sexual abuse, but then you have the actual abuse of relationship and control and so forth. Do you think that, is there a significant difference, do you think?
No, absolutely. That's so true because those males that I've worked with that were being trafficked by traffickers, in that initial grooming process, there's a relationship with the trafficker and the youth that's usually warm and loving. And a trafficker will tell you, me having worked with a former trafficker once in terms of learning how they operate, is that they attempt to become a nice daddy to the young person. And in the vulnerability of the youth who either is not have a father figure in the home, or who has a father figure in the home who is emotionally absent, or person who buys them nice clothes, nice jewelry, takes them to movies, and when it's all about the grooming process. And then at some point, there's a major psychological shift by which the trafficker will say, now it's time for you to pay me back for all that I've done for you. And that's when the selling of the youth to others begins to happen. And there's sort of like this disconnect or this psychological shock from going to a quote unquote loving type person to a person that's now selling you, and the amount of control that they have is insurmountable. It's hard to somehow explain, but I do remember working with a male who got a job, quote unquote, on a cruise ship to be a busboy to save money for college. And that was really not the cruise that put in the ad in the paper. It was a group of traffickers posing as cruise ship workers, and they took him in San Diego and began to traffic him. And when he wanted to go home, he's from Guatemala, I believe. When he wanted to go home and he pleaded to be released, the guy said, well, you can go. But the guy knew his mother's name. He knew his mother's phone number. He knew his mother's address in Guatemala. This is how insidious it gets. And they knew that he had siblings. So he was threatened, like, you want to go, fine, but I know all this information. So he stayed with the group out of fear that some harm would come to his mother, brother, and sister. So these traffickers have really an innate way of maintaining control, and they are abusive. The beatings can be very very hard on people, and the amount of threats are difficult. It's a very difficult thing to have to experience emotionally.
One thing that really is sort of obvious to me is that it's a situation that's not fully appreciated, and so I really appreciate the kind of work that you and Christopher and other people are doing to bring this to the fore. Uh, one thing the John Shea report pointed to is ways in which the issue remains invisible, both to those on the front lines as well as to the victims themselves, who, one of the things is that a lot of the victims tried to get into the study claiming that they were gigolos, that their clients were women, and not admitting to the evidence that the researchers saw that they were actually, their clients were males, because they wanted to get into the study, but the stigma was so great of a male being with a male that they couldn't cross that line. But one particular note is the police encounters with boys. And this is something that I noticed in the report, that the boys would get charged with things like disorderly conduct or drug possession or trespassing, while the girls surpassed the boys in charges of prostitution. And so I'm wondering what kind of progress has been made with educating police and the courts and other people on the front lines about seeing this problem for what it is.
Um, well, I'll give you some information. I'll ask Chris to jump in here. The there seems to be difficulty in getting law enforcement up to get them on our page about what happens with the boys. And it's true that there will be ancillary crimes that get boys involved with juvenile justice, because the traffickers will have them steal for them. They'll have them do drug. I've had clients that did drug running because of the trafficker. And the trafficker's idea is, well, they're underage, so they'll go to juvie. But if I get arrested for meth distribution, they're going to lock me up for a long time. So they don't only exploit the boys for sex, they exploit the boys for crimes. And I think where the law, I'm going to go on a little bit of a limb here. I think the issue with the law, criminal justice system, is that I find a lot of males have issues putting their arms around this particular issue. And I think a lot of it is homophobia. And I think, it's not unlike clients that I've had that have never disclosed their history. And once they have disclosed to someone, the typical response is, you are a guy, this shouldn't have happened to you. You're a guy, you should have got out of it. And I think that, that clear, and then with the stigma of maybe being gay, I think that really keeps them underground more. And I think more often than not, police are encountering these boys based on ancillary crimes, not their exploitation. Chris, do you have any more to add to that?
Yeah, I think that even in my community in Worcester County, I know that law enforcement is actually under the Worcester, the Department of Justice has launched an investigation into Worcester police around the purchasing of women prostitutes. And so I think even being in Massachusetts, a pretty liberal state, that law enforcement in this area has had a lot of consulting with women survivors and all throughout Massachusetts. But I think, like Stephen had said, often boys, I think Stephen and I were trying to meet with some folks to have a meeting around surfacing this in kind of the law landscape, and we really hadn't. No one essentially called us back. So we'll have to circle back at some point, Stephen. But I think that I think that commercial sexual exploitation across the country is known to be a female thing, even though there's really no it's an illusion. Essentially, it is happening to boys. So I think I think of my pimp that was murdered about 2 years ago now. He was murdered by a boy that he met so my pimp was 28 and the boy was 15 years old when they met. I was exchanging sex for needs, survival sex, and my pimp was a very friend-like pimp. He was only around if a transaction was happening. And he had disclosed to me when I was 19 that he was seeing a 15-year-old. And at that moment, I was just trying to pay my rent. I had very barbaric life skills at this point, being a gay growing up in a rural community. I really lacked vocational skills. And there was actually no runaway homeless youth serving provider in the area that I was in as well. So I was kind of like renting a dilapidated apartment for $600. That got me like split wire cable, all this stuff. So he discloses that he's dating a 15-year-old. I kind of brush it off, right? So now, this young adult is now in jail for murdering my pimp. And I did speak to the court-appointed psychiatrist in Norwich, Connecticut, that was appointed to the defense. And I disclosed to them that my experiences with Jason, so that this BIPOC young adult that is now possibly has murdered his own abuser, so that the psychiatrist could see the other side. And really what the psychiatrist said, it was this young adult was absolutely at risk for exploitation. And so I think Black men are not looked as victims. They're looked at in society as violent criminals. And the reality is, this young boy had a very inappropriate relationship, and he's now in jail, possibly serving life in prison. He's still going back and forth in trial, and I'm following the court case. But that just, gives me shivers just to think about how unseen Black and brown young, like even just men in general, are seen as male victims. And so I appreciate to be able to be here one more time to be able to speak about this, because we need more male survivors. And I had the lovely opportunity to go out with Stephen in Ohio this past December. It was the first ever male trafficking retreat for male survivors. And I got to see labor trafficking survivors. I got to see like other sex trafficking survivors that are male. And that was my first time ever like really interacting. I've seen them on social media, and I got to really like connect with them. And it was such a great space, and we all felt safe. And it was just really lovely done. And I know Stephen did a lot of the planning for it. And I hope to be a part of that again. And I hope to even maybe be a part of the planning. But I think it's like the dream team. We need to all come together as males and make this issue unseen so that the police can see it.
One thing I might also mention from the J study is that they said that 9 out of 10 of the people that they interviewed wanted out. They wanted to get out of that situation, and they couldn't really see a way out of there. They couldn't really see how to do it. One thing that really struck me is this quote where one of the victims said, "There have been times when I've been raped in the sense that they will touch and do things to me and they will not pay me." Mm-hmm. And some of them will not pay and they'll just rape you. And what struck me is that he was describing his own rape, not in terms of a violation of his integrity or his personal boundaries, but in terms of a merchandise theft. And another victim would not call a sexual violation rape if given up to prevent a beating. And it seems to speak to what seems to be an incredible mental health issue that's sort of blossoming with these victims. This transactional parsing of self-worth. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and what maybe, what we're learning about that and what we're doing about that sense of worth issue.
Well, I here again, if we look at trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation or survival sex, this usually comes after a long history of trauma. So it's not like, well, I'm 14 years old and I think I'm gonna, hook up with a trafficker or I'm gonna hit the streets or whatnot per se. This, like I said, 80% of girls have a sexual abuse history. 70% of the boys that are trafficked have a sexual abuse history. So there's already issues of trauma that that's majority of these folks are going through. So it's sexual abuse, working, being a part of a family that has substance abuse issues and they pimp out their kid for drug money. It's intergenerational. So grandpa may have been a pimp and grandma was a prostitute, and it just got passed down from generation to generation. So it becomes the family business. Gay kids and trans kids are kicked out of their house, so they're on the street and they're doing what they need to do to survive. And then, so there's a whole host of subsets to the sexual victimization that is one part of a whole story of complex trauma. And what we know with the trafficking, for example, when Chris and I were in Ohio for that wellness retreat, we had a person come in to talk about the effects of trauma on the brain and the effects it has in the developmental process. So if you're a 14-year-old boy who comes from a long history of sexual victimization or other forms of trauma, when you're 25 or 30, that's your chronological age, but developmentally you're still back at 14. And all the boys that I've worked with, only one ever was able to graduate high school. So there's just so much of the trauma that I think you sort of compartmentalize the abuse and you sort of rationalize things this way or that way. So if I'm going to have sex with you and you're going to give me money, but you're not going to beat the shit out of me, excuse my French, then that's a better scenario than getting raped and not getting the money and then getting a beating. So it's sort of like this puzzle where you put together what's the lesser of all the evils that could happen to me. And, with all the trauma in terms of what that does to you developmentally, just sort of puts a beta blocker in that process. And there's just a lot of difficulty around processing and decision making.
Yeah, it would seem to me that would be something that carries on through your whole life. That's hey, that's what my worth. I know that this is true for sex abuse survivors, child sex abuse survivors who are not trafficked. Is that you sort of learn that your worth is what you put out and what you allow with people going over your boundaries, and it's hard to recalibrate that after you've grown up and say, hey, that's maybe not my worth. Maybe my worth is something else.
And obviously boundaries are so much an issue because it's such a egregious series of events which do not respect boundaries. But even with the men that I know, and I know Chris knows a lot of them too, who have reached great professional status, doctors, lawyers, principals of high schools and whatnot, psychologically, they're still quite wounded. And the trauma obviously never goes away, or the memories of the trauma don't go away, or the triggers that cause memories of the abuse never go away. So you could have a bank president at Bank of America, for example, doing quite well, but his private life is usually in emotional pain. And that permeates through the family, in that it's not unusual for these guys to have difficulty in intimate partner relationships. They have difficulty with their own children, being emotionally unavailable, a lot of drinking. So it's amazing to me how professionally they're so well put together. But when they close that office door, it's like another man appears. So for men that are not getting treated for this through therapy and groups and other kinds of activities, it's a very lonely life living a big secret. And I've had men as old as 62 years old in my clinical practice who, when they explain their story to me, I have to say that was trafficking, and they have no sense of that whatsoever. That's what it was, and they've had a lifelong of depression, anxiety, social isolation, and never knew why.
It seems like it's very common, especially with male victims, to put a definition to what happened to them, and I think a lot of this is because society doesn't want to look at it, and so they don't want to look at it. And it seems that it's like when you're in your 30s, 40s, or maybe 50s that you suddenly, like, something in your life is not right, and you go to a therapist, and boom, guess what? You were molested. and,
Yeah.
and you realize it only at that point that, okay, there's the name. That's what it was called. That's what happened to me.
Right. And here again, that goes with the larger narrative around this being just for women and girls. And all the media or TV movies or documentaries on TV are always about just women and girls. So that just gets reinforced from the male victim, and that he has no definition. He has no definition.
I have a question about that, which is, and this is to everybody, is that, do you think that because women are more recognized as victims, that there's a kind of background of salacious interest by, say, police and so on in what's going on with women, whereas there's a more negative view of anything that goes between males, and they don't want to hear about it, they don't want to see it, they don't want to know about it. And I wonder if that's a part of why it's so little recognized, certainly by establishment and here and probably everywhere.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, so yeah, sorry. Well, I think it's almost counterproductive to sometimes, I think, to focus just on the female, because what you're doing is you're creating a society that is actually replicating women and girls being that of victims only, and not recognizing that males can be. You're reinforcing toxic masculinity when you're only focusing on the women and girls. And I just wanted to go, before we get to this next part, just going back, I think as Stephen had said, when survivors are involved in therapy and are, working in the healing, I do recognize that this is exploitation is generational in my family now that I'm at this point in my life. And that's another scary process and thought that I still have to work through, recognizing that my own dad, right, and that my own uncle were sexually abused by a priest in our town when we were growing up, and exploited, was given multiple gifts. At one point, my mom even said that when she was married to my dad, and this was when he was having encounters with the priest, that she had felt jealous of the gifts that he was getting. And so I know, because I've been in a privileged place to have studied and become a sexual assault counselor, I did an internship at Pathways for Change in Worcester, which is Worcester County's Rape Crisis Center. They're open 24/7, and they're just a really great service provider and really advocate for all survivors of all genders, and do a fabulous job, by the way. I think that that's a process that I'm starting to recognize that it has been generational, and just kind of connecting those dots tonight feels kind of good, and I feel like a safe place in this panel to share that.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. I know that that we've had some questions, and I'm wondering if maybe Nathan might be able to pull those up and start to throw some questions at you guys from our audience. Hi, Nathan.
Of course.
By the way, Nathan is Nathan and is on the board. Murray is president of the board of the malesurvivor.org. So go ahead, take it away, Nathan.
Fantastic. So I'll read a couple of the questions. So first one we have for the whole group is, which groups of men or boys have been shown to be at the most risk of trafficking? Is it by race, sexuality, poverty? Is there any statistics or just what you've seen in your own practices, Stephen and Chris?
Well, I would say what's important is to no, I don't have the statistics, but what I do is have the information of how boys are getting recruited in, regardless of sexual orientation or race or whatnot. So a lot of it is the traffickers are very well adept at selecting boys that present as vulnerable. So that or boys that are lonely or isolated, and clearly, so that's one factor. They also homeless youth are at high risk, and the poverty clearly is a big one. People living in poverty or gang infested communities. So the more adversity a boy has in his life, the higher risk he is at. And it really, what makes this important to me, it can affect anyone. And the reason why I say that is I don't want any group of boys to be eliminated because we're saying, only kids from Puerto Rico get exploited, or only people from California. You know, this is like really any male under age of 18 who falls into one of those categories of adverse childhood experiences can be targeted.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Stephen. I would go with the ACEs study with just recognizing that the most marginalized are mostly impacted by this because people are trying to make money, right? So like if you come from a family with lots of money, you may not be as high risk, but it doesn't discriminate exploitation. I mean, it really can happen to anybody. And so I would definitely go like Black and brown young people, Latinx boys, right? Like thinking about all those other subpopulations that are just typically left out of the picture, I think is important.
Yeah, the boys that were, just to dovetail that, the boys that were in my program crossed all economic backgrounds and ethnicities and brown, Black, and white. So it was very diverse.
And I think too, traffickers and exploiters are reaching more young people through technology and apps, right. And stuff like that more often too. So it's really impacting like really all young people at this point. And I think another point to make is like I was working with this young adult that is a typical like DYS young male, like DYS in Massachusetts is a Department of Youth Services. So it's essentially like incarceration for young people. And so like typical, like he doesn't talk, he's very like maybe was gang related at one point, and just has been through the system a lot and doesn't talk to the system, right? But for some reason comes to us for services. So when I'm working with him, it's almost like, it's not like a gaydar, but it's like there's this intuition, and I think other male survivors may know that that someone may be a Brit, like there's just something there. And they were like, yeah, I sell he's like, I sell pictures to this older guy, right? And like I was like, whoa, wait, what? Like, because he was throwing up gang signs when I transported him as a client and different things. And like I kind of felt like there might have been a chance, but I was like, no, like he is so that bias of toxic masculinity really suppressed that. So I think what's really important is really when you're working with young people that are heavily system involved to provide universal supports, like I think men shouldn't have to disclose that they've exchanged sex to meet their needs or sexual content in order to access services. I think like if there's any gut instinct as a caseworker or frontline worker or policy worker, like in your community, like you should be trying to get those services for them.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
Chris, I'd love to follow up because you mentioned kind of ACEs. Do you want to just expand on that a little for people that aren't aware of what the ACEs are and kind of how those scores? Because that's something I think is incredibly important, because perpetrators are incredible masters of manipulation and kind of reading those ACEs scores and who's vulnerable. So if you could expand on that would be fantastic.
Well, the ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And so they could be things like childhood sexual abuse, coming from a home where there's domestic violence, coming from a community where there's a lot of gang violence. Bullying is another one. Truancy is another one. So I think when I mentioned before, when we're looking at complex trauma, we're looking at a variety of difficult life circumstances that are traumatic to various forms that will make a person more vulnerable to a trafficker. So it's just a combination of many different types of trauma.
All right, next question we had, pull it back up. All right, so next question is really more on looking for resources. A person shared, we seem to be talking mostly about homeless or runaway boys. And he said, I'm an example of a group of males that were trafficked by corporate men who preyed on students and males from well-established families. My parents were groomed before me to get to me. Where can I find resources that talk about my group?
Well, I really like that he asked that question, because, we're not, to my point, it can happen to anyone. I don't care if your father makes $5 million a year or you come from a family that you're on public assistance. There's so many different ways where men in power will groom people. Trafficking. So I think one of the better resources, I think, is to contact Men Healing. Murray knows about that group, and they oftentimes have groups and weekend of recovery programs. I've sent some of my clients to them. It's called Men Healing, HEALING, and that might be a good resource. So the one thing I would also like to know is, this person that asked that question, where do they live?
I'll see if they post that anonymously.
Yeah.
Ohio.
Ohio? Okay. Who you want to contact, you know, Chris, what I'm going to say. You want to contact Teresa Flores, Flores, Teresa Flores at the SOAP Project, SOAP, which is Save Our Adolescents from Prostitution. She is a survivor herself. She comes from a wealthy family herself, and she was trafficked. She is a wealth of resources. So I would contact her. And if that gentleman wants to use my name as a referral source, please do so. And I'm going to be seeing Teresa this weekend. I'm flying back to Ohio for a function, and I will let her know that I did this webinar. She may be hearing from somebody.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think too, I don't want to take up too much airtime, but as we talk about like the wealth of information that Teresa has, and we talk about other abusers with wealth that purchase you for sex, I automatically think of the head of school that sexually assaulted me and then gave me money afterwards, even though there was no plan on exchanging sex. I was just excited to be hanging out with them and thinking about how I dismissed that because dismissed the sexual abuse because money was involved, and it's like, okay, well, I'm a product. And when that happened to me when I was 18 years old and 19, this was on multiple occasions, and he also purchased my pimp to have sex with me as he to penetrate me as he watched. But I think that it's important to recognize and look at the statute of limitations in your area and figure out, like, can you still press charges? And that's what I'm doing.
Sure. So one final question, because I know we're running out of time, but I think it's an important one, knowing that child pornography and self-produced child porn are some of the highest growing factors for pornography on the internet. One of our attendees asked, are there any specific red flags for someone being groomed online that we should look out for in young people's lives?
Obvious, I guess we call that sextortion. I think what is important for people to know is there are, I'm thinking of one 16-year-old boy who I did some work with here, who thought he was online with a 16-year-old girl, and she showed him a picture of her breast, but not her face, just her breasts. And then she asked him to take a screenshot of his private area and send it to her. And it was really a guy. And somehow Homeland Security here in New England found out about the situation. Parents know. And, I did some work with the boy. But this is so common. It's off the incredible Richter scale how traffickers are using social media to get posing as, girls, boys, or whatever, to get to a part of the grooming process. And I did see on this Dr. Phil show 2 mothers that were on a month ago whose sons fell prey to that. And when they found out that both boys committed suicide, and one boy, 6 hours after he sent the picture to the trafficker and found out what happened, he committed suicide. So parents really need to have a conversation with kids around appropriate uses of technology, what to watch out for, and it involves them more in staying on top of what their kids are doing on the internet.
Absolutely, Stephen. There's nothing that I need to add to that.
All right, I'll turn it back over to Lee for kind of final thoughts and remarks with our amazing guests.
I just have really one final question. It sort of goes. This one goes to Christopher. Actually, you were describing uh, uh, a couple of questions earlier about the very transactional nature of your sexual relations um, while you were involved in this situation, and I'm just sort of wondering if how you reconciled that, if you have reconciled that into getting away from the transactional uh, portion of that and finding a healthier perspective on your sexual identity, and if that's something that I see that as a potential real challenge for people who have been victimized in trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it definitely doesn't happen overnight. It definitely requires a dream team. And I hope, I think being connected to other survivors really filled my soul. And I hope to really empower other survivors to come forward. Um, I think finding that passion really made my self-esteem grow and my confidence to grow, that I'm more than just a transaction, that I'm not a product, I'm a human. I have a lot to offer than just sex. And I mean, I just got my car at 27, so last year, and got my license. And so even just having that own freedom, like I think a lot of leaving it, I was still very hypersexualized. And now I'm very like, after like a long day's worth of work, being a frontline worker, I'm just like ready to go to bed, honestly. So, and Stephen keeps me pretty busy on the side, like doing like other gigs and other places where I can really educate people. So I'm pretty busy. And then I think staying connected to therapy, absolutely, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Right. Good point. Good point.
And your feelings you're gonna feel down and low, all like you can feel it all the time. I can feel it for the rest of my life, and that's okay.
Mhm.
What you said about community is is worth reminding people that Male Survivor, us who are hosting this, we are a community. We have a very active forum, including a live chat room, and uh, uh, so we do invite anyone to stop by. I thank you very much for showing up, Mr. Procopio and Mr. Bates. I thank you to Dr. Murray Shane, who is our board president, and to Nathan Lachine, who is also on the board. And I wish everyone a pleasant evening.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Murray. Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Bye.
Nathan. Thank you, Nathan. Bye-bye.